2020 has been a terrible year by all accounts. We've all ended up looking to the past and to the future, basically anywhere but here to find even the smallest shred of comfort. Some of you will probably look at your PCs and think, with lockdowns in place and the economy tanking, it's not really the best time to get a graphics card. Maybe a second-hand or a third-hand GeForce GTX 1060 6GB. Well, today we're going to have a look at some stats and some graphs, and we'll see how the GTX 1060 stacks up against the modern day competition. After which, maybe we'll be able to decide whether or not it's a good idea to get one. Originally launched in July 2016, the GeForce GTX 1060 6GB was built on the 16nm process and based on the GP106 graphics processor. In its GP106-400A1 variant, the card featured 1280 shading units, 80 texture mapping units, and 48 ROPs. Paired with 6GB of GDDR5 memory running at 2002 MHz, the GPU operated at a base frequency of 1506 MHz and a boost clock of 1709 MHz. The price at launch was a rather tasty $299 US. The model we'll be looking at as our baseline today is the Manni Gallardo GTX 1060 6GB, which had a slightly higher base clock at 1531 MHz and a boost clock of 1746 MHz. First up, gaming benchmarks. Grand Theft Auto 5 might be an old benchmark, but it really does push modern hardware to the limit. This is borne out in the numbers, with the GTX 1660 and 1060 in a virtual dead heat. Carrying the same memory configuration, 6GB of GDDR5 VRAM, while battling a very memory-intensive game, the result is disappointing but not really surprising. The RTX 2060 by comparison outpaces both cards by 45% at 1080p, 48% at 1440p, and 52% at 4K. This is of course at 4 times anti-aliasing. It won't even go at 8 times anti-aliasing, obviously. In comparison, the GTX 1080 Ti at this point is already on a different planet before the 1060 has even left Los Santos. F1 2018 is an example of a beautiful game that has been optimized fantastically well. Game performance scales very well at any resolution, as evidenced by the numbers. Here, the generational successor of the 1060, the 1660, beats it by 25% at 1080p, 25% at 1440p, and 26% at 4K. The gap between the 1660 to the RTX 2060 is also about roughly the same, 21% at 1080p, 26% at 1440, and 31% at 4K. Of course, this is put into perspective by the GTX 1080 Ti, which completely destroys the 1660 with a relative difference of 55% at 1080p, 62% at 1440p, and 115% at 4K. However, having said that, the GTX 1060 actually offers 30 frames per second performance, almost console-esque at 4K resolution, so if you could, you would, but really you shouldn't. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it is natural to find the GTX 1660 right in between the 1060 and the RTX 2060. However, the GTX 1660 outpaces the 1060 by 22% at 1080p, 26% at 1440p, and 28% at 4K. Then again, 4K performance is basically non-existent for this hardware configuration, so please just don't bother. Last but not least in our small game roundup, Battlefield 5. Now, a multiplayer game like Battlefield 5 will prioritize frames per second to deliver a smooth gaming experience, which is obviously a critical aspect of Twitch shooters. And the GTX 1060 delivers this right at 1080p. Just don't bother with 4K. Considering the generational gap between the 1660 and 1060, which stands at 14% at 1080p, 33% at 1440p, and 53% at 4K, but then again that's also rather useless because of the frame rate, you can see that the 1660 does offer a reasonable generational improvement compared to its predecessor. So what does this all mean, really? Is the 1060 worth it? So where does that leave us in conclusion? Well, the GTX 1060 doesn't embarrass itself too badly, actually. It actually holds up pretty well against its more modern competition. Obviously, all of the data for the GTX 1060 ends up at the bottom of the chart, but it still delivers decent frame rates, especially at 1080p, which is still the most popular gaming resolution in the entire world. There is a little bit of surprise though, considering that it was tied with the 1660 in Grand Theft Auto 5, but this is of course a function of the limited VRAM, GDDR5 at that, rather than any, hokey pokey in particular. But at the same time, it also puts into perspective the sheer performance of the GTX 1080 Ti, which is, a 3-year-old card at this point and is still capable of holding its own with the newer RTX graphics cards from Nvidia. So let's put a little bow on this and tie it all up and consider the question: is the GTX 1060 worth it? Still worth it in 2020? Absolutely. If you're on a budget, of course it is. In a year or so, maybe it won't be, with new tech like DLSS, ray tracing, even AMD's Radeon sharpening, all that stuff that comes with newer GPUs. Maybe that stuff will be more important in a year's time when Big Navi hits. We don't know for sure. But until then, you'd be more than happy with the GTX 1060. If you're gaming in that particular resolution at 1080p, and if you're in that particular price range where a second-hand one can go below $100. If you're in anything like a 7 series GeForce or older, you really should upgrade at this point in time, And well, yeah, that's all to say about that, isn't there? It's not the best piece of good news for 2020, but at least it's some good news, especially for those of us shopping around in the budget categories. And that's all from me. See you guys in the next one.